Question: which Rutherford is best? False. Ernest Rutherford. Rutherford. Radium. Return of the Jedi. Radium is not a subject that you see come up frequently in Watchtower publications. In fact, a search of the Watchtower Library online gives only 14 hits for the word radium. However, I recently read a fascinating reference to radium in the Golden Age magazine, and I thought it was worth a bit of discussion. I recently started reading the Golden Age magazine just for kicks. Golden Age, of course, later became known as Consolation, and finally as the Awake magazine, which Jehovah's Witnesses actually seem to be trying to fade out slowly but surely here. But for many years, it's been a very popular issue. What's interesting in reading the Golden Age, which started in 1919, and I'm up to 1920 now, the tone of the articles back then is fairly different from how it is in recent times. In recent years, typically what you'd see in the Awake is a discussion of a given problem, societal problem or environmental problem, and it'll delve into how big of a problem it is, and then talk about how man is unable to solve it, and finally that only God's kingdom has the solution. That is a little different than how the Golden Age approached things that they saw in the world. What you really sense in those early articles is a sense of excitement about how nothing was unsolvable. There was a sort of happy naivete that mankind combined with God would be able to fix and beautify everything on the earth. And so you think about the time period that the articles were being published. World War I had just ended, so that's a good thing. Everyone that was helping to run the Watchtower Society got out of prison in 1919, so that's a big positive. Big business was booming after the war ended. Everybody had a job. People were getting raises. There were major scientific advances. It seemed like every week some new invention was displayed or new discovery was announced. Airplanes were new, railroads, growing giant vegetables, irrigating desert lands. And the general thrust of the Golden Age magazine was that this tremendous progress that mankind was making would just keep on going. It would just flow naturally right into the Golden Age with capital letters, the 1,000-year reign of Christ Jesus over the earth. So the Golden Age magazine back then was really excited about scientific discoveries being made, things that engineers of the day were coming up with. Several times so far I've seen the idea that in the new system there wouldn't be one Einstein or one Edison. There would be hundreds and thousands of Einsteins and Edisons that would work together to make the earth a beautiful paradise. When it comes down to it, that era was perhaps the best time in all of history you could pick to be a Jehovah's Witness or to be a Bible student, as they were known then. In those years, you could celebrate Christmas. You could celebrate birthdays. There was no rule against blood transfusions. There was no shunning of people who left or were kicked out of the organization. There was no secret database of child abusers. It was essentially at that time a mainstream Christian church, very similar to most other churches, and the only real differences were some theological points that could be argued. And so with that background, in the June 1920 issue, there was an article published by J.W. Coolidge, M.D. Presumably, having his article published, he was a Bible student at that time. And I've seen so far in about the 18 months I've read, Dr. Coolidge had contributed a couple of articles, one every so often. The Golden Age magazine typically would, in every issue, have articles about health or diet, that type of thing. And generally it's promoting kind of farmer's almanac, folk wisdom type remedies for being sick. For example, it suggested eating lettuce to help cure insomnia. One article advised doing regular enemas every day for until you get all cleaned out. It said it's important to have your insides just as clean as your hands would be outside after washing your hands. Most of the issues have a recipe section where readers would send in recipes that they like to cook. And so Dr. Coolidge has an article printed. So I'm not going to read the entire article, but we'll take a look at some of the high points here. His article is entitled Life and the Life Giver. It begins, as a matter of pure reason, it must infallibly be that the proper means and agencies for the care and preservation of our bodies have been provided, that it is only a wise provision of a kind and beneficent Creator. What are these agencies, and are all discoverable by man? All human experience affirms that they are. So the basic premise of the article is that Jehovah God essentially from day one planned out everything that mankind would need to be happy and successful, and it only depends on man to discover these things one by one and then put them into practice. It's almost like Jehovah is a parent on Easter, and he went out early and hid a bunch of Easter eggs in the yard, and then the kids go out and discover where all the Easter eggs are. And this is a very common theme in the Golden Age magazine. Basically taken from Daniel 12:4, the idea that knowledge was presented but hidden for many years. It would be sealed up until the time of the end, and then man would rove about and true knowledge would become abundant. And so that's a common scripture for witnesses today in spiritual terms, that spiritual understanding of the Bible and prophecies would be understood, of course, only by Jehovah's Witnesses in the time of the end. But Bible students back then applied this scripture to not just spiritual things, but all fields of human endeavor. And so things like steam engines, trains, electricity, automobiles, airplanes, blimps, medical discoveries, all these things were included in Daniel 12:4 as knowledge that would become abundant. And so Dr. Coolidge continues, new discoveries are always consequent upon new effort. First, the sense of the need, then the finding of what has always been in nature, simply awaiting its day. Just another step forward and the unknown is revealed. So we see this idea emphasized that basically the march of progress is inevitable. And really it would be almost ungrateful or like you're snubbing Jehovah if you would ignore these things, these discoveries, and not take advantage of them. They are gifts from God Himself. And so he continues getting down to the very crux of the article here. We may therefore accept it as an axiom that the spirit cannot function at its highest when the body does not, that it is our chief duty to keep well, to use every known preventive means to this end, as well as to seek creative and restorative measures when there are departures from normal bodily conditions. In this our day came the discovery of electricity and of radium. These discoveries did not happen by accident, for nothing happens by accident. And so this is Dr. Coolidge's main thrust of the article, that electricity and radium are things Jehovah left for humans to discover to really elevate their plane of existence. And in the rest of the article, basically Dr. Coolidge really waxes rather poetically about how awesome radium is. He says, but the discovery of electrical energy and radioactivity came at the exact time when human intelligence was sufficiently advanced to understand them and to grasp their true import. He continues, but radium is of itself such a spectacular element. And its discovery is so recent that many of the romantic features of its advent into the human world are yet unwritten. He ends his article by saying, "This strange substance or form of energy called radium, a solar energy or sun product or whatnot, is more wonderful than all the dreams and imaginations of the human mind since the dawn of creation." So this article was published in 1920, and radium was a fairly new metal that had been discovered just 20 years earlier in 1899. It was one of the many radioactive metals or elements that Marie Curie discovered along with her husband, and she of course won the Nobel Prize for her research. As the article states, radium was known to be radioactive. It would emit these various waves and particles that could be detected, and it required no power source. It did it all by itself. A sufficient quantity of these metals would glow, and they could be warm to the touch even with no energy source. Radium and uranium, all these radioactive elements were really fascinating to scientists and to the general public back then. What wasn't known for a few more years was how dangerous radioactive substances could be to the human body. In his article, Dr. Coolidge writes, "Its force is strikingly akin to the actual vital forces of the cells of our body, by which all the life functions of our bodies are sustained." And so he is correct that radium acts on our physical anatomy, but unfortunately not as a cure. What we now know is that radium and other radioactive substances cause cell mutations, and enough radioactive exposure will cause cancer. What's ironic nowadays is that one of the only uses for radium is as a cancer treatment. It can be used as in radiation therapy to target and shrink tumors. But even so, it's not really a commonly used radiation therapy today, because the trouble is that radium continues to decay and it turns into radon gas. Now, radon itself is radioactive, but it's even more dangerous because it's a gas, so you can just breathe it into your body and suffer more exposure from that source. Now, there's other radioactive metals or elements that don't release gas in the same way, and so they're typically used more often than radium simply because it's safer for those around it. So that's the funny conundrum. Radium can be used to treat cancerous tissue, but when healthy cells are exposed to radium, the radium can cause cancer in them. And all of that really was not well understood at all in 1920. At the time, one of the popular uses for radium was to make watch hands that would glow in the dark. It was used on airplane dials and clocks, watches, that type of thing. And so the women who worked in these factories were called radium girls. A lot of them developed cancer from their work. The trouble is, you can imagine painting the hands of a watch is very tiny work. And so they would have these tiny little paintbrushes that they needed to have a very sharp point on. And so what the company recommended was to lick the end of the paintbrush to create that fine point, dip it in the radium paint, and then paint the watch hands or the dial of the watch. And then repeat, lick, dip, paint. So it was just after a few years that many of the women started developing cancer in their jaw and dying. In fact, even the head chemist at one of the radium companies died from exposure. And so in the late 20s, there were many noticeable lawsuits against these radium companies because they knew about the dangers of radium exposure at that point and kept it a secret from their workers on the assembly line. So there was about a 10-year period or so when radium treatments were super popular as medical cures and kind of quack therapy at the time. There were radioactive spas you could go to. You could buy radiated water. There were belts that you could wear, radioactive toothpaste, and of course medicines or tonics that had radioactive substances in them. And so it's right in this period in 1920 that our Dr. Coolidge writes this glowing article for the Golden Age about using radium for health purposes as a gift from God, essentially. So that would be noticeable enough. But what really caught my interest was the article following his article. So you can see here, it's just a short article, comment on the foregoing, but notice the author, J.F. Rutherford. Now that immediately caught my eye because as far as I can remember, so far in my 18 months worth of Golden Age issues that I've read, there was only one article before this that was attributed to Rutherford as the author. Rutherford had written quite a lengthy article about irrigation efforts in California's Imperial Valley, kind of along the lines of what's in the movie Chinatown. And he was basically explaining that that was just a small sample of what humans together with God would accomplish in paradise. So it was very rare that Rutherford would write an article for the Golden Age himself. And so we'll see what he felt so strongly about that he was moved to write an article himself. The article begins, "The article by Dr. Coolidge concerning the application of radium as a vital force is interesting to me. About a year ago, I suffered from a severe case of pneumonia, and Dr. Coolidge was my physician." So Rutherford explains here that he had a bad case of pneumonia about a year earlier. Now keep in mind, this is 1920. We know that 1918 to 1919, he spent about 8 or 9 months in federal prison, serving that 20-year sentence for sedition and whatnot. Incidentally, that's one subject that I've seen several times in the Golden Age magazines is prisons and prison reform. They're kind of funny articles. Basically, the thrust is that pretty much everybody in prison is a pretty swell guy, and they treat each other fairly, and they're really not getting a fair shake in society. And there's many interesting suggestions that the articles would offer. For example, the best one I remember is that it recommended that any judge who sentences people to prison should be required himself to do time in that prison. So it recommended the judge should have to do 30 days in any jail that he sends people to, and 60 days in any prison that he sentences prisoners to. Another suggestion was that all prison wardens and prison employees should actually be ex-convicts themselves because they really know how to treat the prisoners fairly. Most of these articles didn't have bylines, and it's hard to say who was writing them, but it's kind of funny that there was definitely a great deal of interest for the Golden Age editors in prisoners. So at any rate, we know Rutherford did some time in prison, and the 75 yearbook talks a little bit about his stay there. As it is, during the months of their incarceration in the Atlanta Penitentiary, Brothers Rutherford and Van Amber had shared a cell having no air circulation due to a fan malfunction. Being unable to get sufficient oxygen, their systems had been filled with poisons. While Rutherford was imprisoned, in fact, a lung condition had developed that stayed with him for the rest of his earthly life. Shortly after his release, he contracted pneumonia. Brother Rutherford became so ill that his survival was in question. Because of his physical condition and owing to the fact that his family was in California, he went there. So the yearbook attributes Rutherford's lung problems to this cell without enough ventilation, which filled him with poisons. It's funny that nothing is ever mentioned in the publications about the effects on William Van Amber of these poisons, who shared the same cell and was in fact several years older than Rutherford was. It's almost like pneumonia isn't caused by stale air, but by bacteria or viruses. Who knows? I mean, someday perhaps we'll figure it out. But I digress. And so Rutherford, in his 1920 article, explains some of the treatment that Dr. Coolidge prescribed to get over the pneumonia. During the period of convalescence, he provided me with a radio solar pad or belt, which I wore with great profit to myself. I have since recommended it to others who have likewise benefited by it. This pad, I understand, is manufactured by the Radium Appliance Company of Los Angeles, California, And the process of manufacture is to diffuse through a massive paste by the power of electricity a small quantity of radium, and out of this the pad is manufactured. If the pad is held in the sunlight for 5 minutes, it can be taken into a dark room and will photograph itself. In other words, it absorbs the energy of the sun and transmits that to the human system. I believe that this will prove very beneficial to humanity, and so recognizing it, I am glad to call attention to it. Now, most likely you, like myself, were quite familiar with Rutherford moving to California for his health, and the organization over the years has been quite eager to share the urgent health need for Rutherford to live in California for his lungs. But this is actually the first time I'd ever heard of this part of the treatment for Rutherford's pneumonia. I've never seen it mentioned in the Proclaimer's book or other history that's published by Jehovah's Witnesses. And that's probably because just a few years after this glowing recommendation, the dangers of radium would become widely known. So what was this belt that he was wearing? Well, we see here actually a picture of the radio solar belt that Rutherford wore. As Rutherford describes, the radium appliance company basically felt that the way it worked was it would amplify the sun's energy. And so if you expose the pad to sunlight, that would make it work better. And then strapping it to yourself, all that vital energy from sunlight would be released into your body and accelerate its healing powers. Now, needless to say, that is not at all how radioactivity works. There's really no connection to being exposed to sunlight, and it works entirely on its own without that aspect of it. Now, the Radium Appliance Company also published a sales brochure to accompany their pad that they sold, and let me tell you, that brochure is very interesting reading. Incidentally, you can see that the company actually had its offices in the Bradbury building in LA. That was the really amazing building, the structure that was seen in the movie Blade Runner. So I'll pick a few of the high points from their sales brochure to go over here. They report, modern science has demonstrated that a minute particle of radium produces even more remarkable effects upon the human body than was ever dreamed of by the Indian medicine man, and that even a small quantity of high-grade radium ore contains sufficient radium to affect the circulating blood cells and tissues of the human organism. Well, they weren't wrong about that. It certainly does have an effect on the tissues and blood cells. Now, they included instructions on the best way to use the radium belt. You can see here in this little ad, this was the general idea of how to wear it. You would kind of strap it to the small of your back there and then walk around with it all day, or you could wear it at night as well. The brochure has some more detailed suggestions here. For all ordinary ailments, the pad may be worn across the back just above the hips. From this position, its energy can freely penetrate all the organs of the lower part of the body. For weak lungs and all pulmonary trouble, wear a pad between the shoulders, across the back, suspended by one cord around the neck and the other across the chest to hold it in position. So I can't tell you which way Rutherford would wear it, whether he used it as the belt or around his chest, or maybe he alternated positions. Can't say that at this point. And how long did the appliance company recommend using the radium belt? To obtain permanent beneficial results, the radioactive solar pad must be worn from 10 to 60 days, or even longer in stubborn cases. In many cases, a marked improvement will be apparent after using it 3 days. The effects of radiation exposure depend on several factors. One is how close you are to the radiation source. So being a foot away from radiation is not as bad as having it sitting against your skin or ingesting it. And the other major factor is the length of time that you're exposed to the source. So how long each day, and then how many days in total. So how much did Rutherford use his own radium belt? Did he wear it just for the 10 to 60 days? Did he keep using it? Was he wearing it when he was giving talks? Did he wear it at night or during the day? It's hard to say at this point. We can assume definitely that he stopped using it by the late 20s because that's when all the Radium Girl lawsuits were public knowledge. So we've established, one, how the radium belt would be used, and then secondly, what the effects of radium are on the human body. So knowing that, we can now start to look at the third factor, which is how Rutherford actually died. And for someone that died so long ago, we actually have a fair bit of information on his last few weeks of life. So we'll skip forward 20 years up to around 1940. As we'll see in just a few minutes from his death certificate, he was diagnosed with colon cancer in 1940, and at this point he was around the age of 70. Now, colon cancer at that time period was a pretty rough diagnosis. There really wasn't much in the way of treatment for it. Chemotherapy hadn't been invented yet. And basically most of the treatments were palliative in nature. They were more centered on easing the suffering of the person as they would inevitably die from it. So he was diagnosed in 1940, and then in 1941 was when the witnesses held their annual convention, of course, every summer. And in 41 they picked St. Louis, Missouri as the source, as the location for the convention. And it was very well attended. Over 100,000 witnesses came. As an interesting side note, Rutherford himself Missouri was his home state. He was born there, grew up, and lived there right up until he moved to Brooklyn, Bethel, to be the lawyer for the Watchtower Society. So perhaps Missouri was chosen for sentimental reasons. Rutherford probably knew that would be the last convention that he would ever attend. So the convention was held in August. And then a couple months later, by November, the cancer had progressed to the point that he desperately needed surgery, probably due to a bowel obstruction from the tumors growing in his belly. And a bowel obstruction definitely would kill you within a few days if it's left untreated. Going back to the 75 yearbook, it has a bit of information. By November, Brother Rutherford's critical illness had gained ground, and he was compelled to have an operation at Elkhart, Indiana. So there isn't a whole lot of detail there. I'm not sure why he picked Elkhart, Indiana to go for surgery. I can only assume that there was an experienced surgeon that was operating out of Elkhart that Rutherford picked to do this operation. And so the Proclaimer's book has a bit more information. It tells us Brother Rutherford had developed cancer of the colon and was in poor health at the St. Louis Convention. Still, he managed to give 5 strong discourses. Following the convention, however, his condition worsened and he was compelled to have a colostomy. These days, having a bowel resection and a colostomy creation is certainly a major surgery, but it's a fairly straightforward surgery. There's not too many complications as a general rule. And so notice how Rutherford talked about his surgery back at that time from the Proclaimer's book. Arthur Worsley recalls the day Brother Rutherford said goodbye to the Bethel family. He confided in us that he was going to undergo a serious operation and that whether he lived through it or not, he was confident that we would keep on proclaiming Jehovah's name. He concluded by saying, "So, if God wills, I will see you again. If not, keep up the fight." There was not a dry eye in the family. Initially reading that, I just assumed he was being a bit melodramatic about what the surgery would do. However, I have to correct myself as I've done a little reading up on bowel resections in that time period. It was a brutal operation, let me tell you. They would basically start on the front side, open up your belly, and carve out all sorts of things from there, do the colostomy creation. Then they would flip you over and go to work on the backside and basically carve out huge areas of your backside and your rectum and lymph nodes, taking out all kinds of stuff. The one journal article I saw from that time period mentioned a 40% mortality rate from the operation. I have to admit, Rutherford was not exaggerating. This was a touch and go kind of operation. but he did survive it. And he spent a week or so there at the Elkhart General Hospital recuperating. In 1941, there was a single pioneer woman named Hazel Burford. She was stationed in Kentucky, and she'd been pioneering about 10 years so far. She would eventually attend the second class of Gilead and be sent to Panama, where she stayed for many years as a missionary. But prior to pioneering, she had gone through nursing school and had worked as a nurse for about a year and a half before quitting to become a pioneer. Now, interestingly, that info about her background was evidently in her Watchtower files that Bethel had on her. And so after Rutherford's operation, the society called her and asked if she would be Rutherford's nurse during his recuperation. So she had a bit of a life story published in 1955 where she gives a little bit more information here. She says, in 1941, when working isolated territory in western Kentucky, we attended the Zone, now Circuit, Assembly at Cape Girardeau, Missouri. While preparing the evening meal in the cafeteria, I was called to answer a long-distance telephone call offering me the privilege of helping to nurse Brother Rutherford, then very ill in a hospital in Elkhart, Indiana. Shocked by news of his illness, overwhelmed by tremendous responsibility I would be expected to shoulder, my first reaction was to refuse. But, ever fearful of refusing an assignment for fear another would not be given, I prayerfully accepted. At once I left the assembly headquarters and made the necessary preparations for my new duties, upon which I entered 36 hours later when I entered the sick room of our stricken brother. A week later I was privileged to accompany Brother Rutherford and his party to California, where we lived in Beth Sarum, the house of the princes, for the next 8 weeks until his death January 8, 1942. Had I not been a pioneer, that unusual and precious service would not have been mine, as all his associates and helpers were from ranks of full-time workers. So this is a rather interesting account that Hazel relates here. First, I thought it was kind of interesting that the society was able to track her down so quickly, even though she was at an assembly in a different state than the state she was living in at the time. And then she talks about her great fear. She says, ever fearful of refusing assignment for fear another one would not be given, she accepted this task. Now her perspective is that it was only because she was a pioneer that she had this opportunity. I might argue it from the other way and say that only a pioneer would have been offered this assignment, because otherwise a nurse would have been working full-time and would have had to quit her job to be Brother Rutherford's nurse. And so only a pioneer could have taken that assignment to work for free and take care of the president. As Hazel explains, the surgery bought Rutherford 8 more weeks of life. However, they could not have been comfortable weeks. Notice what the Proclaimer's book has to say. Brother Rutherford, 72 years of age, survived the surgery. Shortly thereafter, he was taken to a residence in California he had named Beth Sarum. It was evident to his loved ones and to medical experts that he would not recover. In fact, he required further surgery. So evidently, after the initial humongous surgery, once he got to California, he required further surgery to go back in. And Hazel, in the 75 yearbook, describes Rutherford's days at that time. She says, "We had the interesting times, for he got to where he would sleep all day, and then all night long he was busy with the society's business, and kept us on the move." I can only assume and really hope for his sake that during those weeks at Beth Sarum he was well doped up on morphine and any other pain meds that were available in 1941. They could not have been pleasant weeks for him. On December 7th, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entered World War II. It had to make for anxious times for anybody living on the west coast of the United States. Rutherford continued to fade over these last few weeks, and his death certificate fills in the final details for us. We'll take a look at that. And so here we see the first page of the death certificate for Joseph Franklin Rutherford. And here's the main part of the death certificate. So you can see on the right side there that he died on January 8th, 1942. The time of death is recorded at 1:36 p.m. It's filled out by Dr. Stevenson, who was evidently Rutherford's physician in California. And so you notice in the middle there, it describes his diagnosis of carcinoma of the rectum 18 months earlier, pelvic metastasis, or in other words, other tumors growing in his pelvis that had spread from the rectum about 6 months earlier. It notes his surgery on November 5th for carcinoma of the rectal sigmoid. So that was evidently the bowel resection. And on the first line, it mentions the immediate cause of death was uremia, which is just another word for renal failure or kidney failure. So no doubt the cancer, as it metastasized throughout his belly and his pelvis, had spread to affecting his kidneys, and perhaps they were obstructed, or in other ways went to kidney failure. And hemodialysis, kidney dialysis, hadn't been invented at that time, and that was, as a result, what finally killed Rutherford. The left side just gives a little demographic information there. It describes him living on Braeburn Road, which was where Beth Sarum was or is located. And you can see down there on line 16, the informant helping to fill out this certificate was Bonnie Heath. That was Bonnie Boyd before she was married. It was Rutherford's personal secretary. And then she married William Heath, who was one of the heirs to the Coca-Cola fortune. And you can see they were all basically living in the same place in Beth Sarum there and in Beth Shan next door. And so how interesting is it to think about where the radium appliance company generally recommended to wear the radium belt, right on the small of your back, and then to compare that with where Rutherford later got cancer in the sigmoid colon, the little stretch of colon between your rectum and the rest of the large intestine or colon. Again, right there near your back. Now I knew he had colon cancer, and I just always assumed that it was from his heavy alcohol use, which is a major risk factor for colon cancer. However, learning about his enthusiasm for the radium belt, for me it either replaces the alcohol use as the main risk factor that led to his getting cancer, or certainly complements it as two major things that made it almost inevitable that he would get cancer later in life. What's left unanswered, and what I really wonder about, is how many readers of the Golden Age took Rutherford's recommendation to heart, bought their own radium belt, were using it, and eventually got cancer as a result down the road. Another question I'm curious about is, given how enthusiastic he was about it here in 1920, did he ever come back and retract that and give a warning about radium in later years? Again, I'm only up to about 1920 in the Golden Age, so if I see a follow-up article in later issues, I'll be sure and do another video about that. One thing that has definitely lived on from that era is a great enthusiasm among Jehovah's Witnesses for wacky or fringe medical treatments. They seem to come in waves through the congregations. One I remember in particular years ago was reflexology, which is the idea that by massaging or pushing on different spots on your feet, that can cure all sorts of medical conditions in the rest of the body. And witnesses in my area were getting certified and trained in doing reflexology, and they would set up little businesses giving treatments to all the other witnesses. And then, like these things do, they kind of fizzled out in a few years and was forgotten. I guess in that way, Rutherford's legacy still thrives today. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little glimpse into Watchtower history. Thanks for watching. And just remember, identity theft is not a joke, Jim. Millions of families are affected every year. Michael?